I'm Michael Kluckner. I'm the president of the society, and as we always do, we acknowledge the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, and especially, as you will have seen on the slide, of the Kitsilano Indian Reserve, which in terms of the way things have worked out is considered to be Squamish territory, and there was a village here at the time of contact and the beginning of settlement. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's lecture and our speaker tonight on the subject of West Vancouver. And not that long ago, we had Daniel Francis here, and he was speaking on North Vancouver. And those of you who were here or who know North Vancouver will know kind of the industrial working class quality of it, and what a sharp contrast that has been historically with West Vancouver as soon as you cross over the Capilano River. These elements of, particularly of post-war Vancouver, of the prestige of a West Vancouver address, of the British properties, of the Lionsgate Bridge, of all of these sorts of things that you were almost entering into another world when you crossed over there, into an area that was just purely residential at that time. Probably it was more or less new money compared with the old money that was in Shaughnessy, but these things have kind of moved around over the years. Now, our speaker tonight, Francis Mansbridge, is no stranger to British Columbia history, to the history of this region. He's the author of 8 books that are particularly about historical subjects, and he has a doctorate in English from the University of Ottawa. He began his interest in local history with the Burrard Dry Dock and with the Burrard Dry Dock papers, and working on them and subsequently publishing a book. The subject of his book tonight is Dreamers and Designers, The Shaping of West Vancouver. And this follows along from a 2011 book, Cottages to Community, The Story of West Vancouver's Neighborhoods, which is a very, very good book, and highly recommended. I don't know if it's still in print, but if you can round up a copy somewhere, it's a good addition to a library that would have a little bit of something from the different neighborhoods, the different regions of the Vancouver area. And Francis also has a new book, or at least a new edition of a book of his, Of Vancouver Then and Now, that has come out. Please join me in welcoming Francis Mansbridge.
I gave a short talk recently, and someone came up to me afterwards and they said, "Are you an architect?" And I said, "No." They said, "Are you an historian?" And I said, "No." He said, "Then what are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm a storyteller." And I think that's maybe not very kind of prestigious among historians or people who write history to be storytellers, but I think it's a way the stories of the past tell us where we've been, and maybe they tell us where we are, and perhaps even where we're going. And so I'll like to talk to you a bit about ways of living in West Vancouver, stories about that which are drawn largely from the book which Michael was mentioning, Dreamers and Designers, and if the passion for buying one strikes you, Dave Barker here will oblige you at the end of the talk. And I'm also, I love to have questions. I'm told that maybe in this format it's better to leave the questions to the end, but certainly there'll be time at the end for any questions or insights you have, as that's when I learn from things from you. Well, I'd like to start off by just mentioning a few facts about West Vancouver which you may not know, and if you do, fine. But between 2001 and 2011, West Vancouver lost 1,700 jobs. Fewer than 10% of municipal staff live in the city where they work. And you could extrapolate that to other professions. And in 2016, 27.8% of the population is over 65. The population has decreased either slightly or substantially, depending on which figures you believe, but it has decreased between 2011 and 2016. And if you want to buy a house in 2017, an income of $500,000 a year was needed. And so these all, of course, relate to each other. And I think you know, I try to point that out in the book, and we can maybe talk about it a bit, certainly tonight, the way that things have developed in ways of living over the last 100 and some years. So the first slide, West Vancouver, of course, started off as a place where there were huge trees, even more, I think, than Vancouver. Many of the trees were used in building ships, in houses, and the shingles were exported throughout the world. This was a tremendous economic benefit for the growth of West Vancouver. The first major logging company on the North Shore was the Moodyville Sawmill Company between 1870 and 1890. And many companies were attracted by these huge trees. I have heard, although I've never actually seen concrete evidence of it, that some of the earliest houses were built on tops of these stumps. And certainly it would be a lot easier to build them on those stumps than on some of the, you know, the rather messy land underneath it. This is a red cedar tree. You'll notice there are a lot of, there we are, a lot of these springboard notches. I think there are 3, 4, 5, 6, there are about 10 on this one side. And first time I saw it, I wondered, why are there so many springboard notches on this? And of course the springboards were used because it was easier to saw the tree down or chop it, and sawing at this point, if you were a little bit above the broader base at the bottom. And some of these may be explained by the fact they moved it across as they you know, progressed in the felling it. I'm not sure why some of them are so low, but you know, this is one of the mysteries which, you know, maybe somebody will come along and explain to me one day. But this is the type of trees that people were felling, and which the mills were attempting to process, although many of the mills certainly could not deal with a tree of this size. And many of the companies that thought, well, we can make a lot of money, most of them didn't do all that well. Most of them went broke, apart from a few like McNair and Shields. And so now, yes, this is after a fire, apparently, and these are standing cedars, and this is the type of work that was required to clear the land and to build houses on. Even the standing dead cedar was certainly very possible, producing shingles and lumber and so on, but it was tremendously hard and painstaking work. And what I'm kind of going on and suggesting is that there were several different phases of West Vancouver, and this early stage was one of the, I suppose, the most difficult and challenging stages, but very different from the later ones. So, yeah. Now, this is interesting for a number of reasons. The early settlers in Ambleside and Dundurov mostly lived along the waterfront. Many of them just lived here seasonally. And this is kind of interesting for us too, because their grandson is right here, and he's selling books. So I'm not quite sure what that all indicates, or how you can explain that connection. But West Vancouver, the history is quite short, really, in West Vancouver, and I guess it's here too. And so many people lived along the shore. There were maybe 1,000 people who lived in Dundurab during the summer, and only maybe 300 in the winter. It was kind of a hippie haven for a lot of people in those days, and you could live a very pleasant life, a very social life, a very enjoyable life in the summer on the waterfront. And now that's one way of living previously in the shacks and tents on the shore. In 1899, Francis Caulfield came to live in the area which now bears his name in the western part of West Vancouver. He purchased 1,000 acres of coastal land that became this community, selling lots to a select few, including a lady by the name of Julia Henshaw, who's certainly, I'm sure many of you are familiar with through Michael's book. Francis Caulfield was a very educated person. He was a graduate of Oxford, a former manager of Lloyd's Bank, the author of a translation of the Odyssey, which he read to a garden party one time in his home. I don't know, hope he didn't read the whole thing. But he tried to transplant an English community complete with a church, a village church, to West Vancouver. Even the trees were grown from English product, oaks, of course. You wouldn't have spruce or pine in Caulfield. You have oaks, and the streets, lanes were very much kind of a recreation of what an English village might be like his hometown in Clovelly in Devon, and based also to a large extent on Ebenezer Howard's English Garden City plans, which now are expressed in a town, Letchworth, just north of London. This is probably the Kilby family. They're on their way down to the beach to bathe, and when you're one of the propertied classes, as the wealthy classes, as the people in Caulfield by and large were at this time, and still now for that matter, this is how you dressed. And I don't know, I don't know if they swam at all actually, but they certainly wouldn't go far swimming in the outfits they have on. But and anyway. But it was one is tempted to say an idyllic life, and you know, I think, you know, it's a temptation to romanticize the past, which we should maybe steer clear of. But still, it did provide activities which today would not be possible. This is in Horseshoe Bay, and certainly you wouldn't be doing that in Horseshoe Bay today, or probably too many parts, so probably nowhere along the waterfront. I like the way that they both have their hats. Even the men always wore hats. Even the loggers earlier on were wearing hats. And of course you could go down and you could rent a boat. There were hundreds of boats for rent, and one could go down and take one's lady or one's man or whoever out and have a wonderful time out paddling in the water. Time between about 1925 and 1950 is when a lot of the activities which left their mark on West Vancouver took place. This is the Salmon Derby, as it says in Horseshoe Bay, and this started in 1938 was started by the Sewell family. It attracted luminaries as diverse as Bing Crosby, John Diefenbaker, and Roy Rogers, and no Trigger apparently, but you know, it was a marvelous event, and people caught large salmon, which diminished in size as the years went by actually, but it was a great time. It was a party time, of course, and West Vancouver and Horseshoe Bay was one of the centers of that throughout the 1930s and 1940s. And this also, first beach in Eagle Harbor, which would be just between Caulfield and Horseshoe Bay. And it's, again, there are a lot of people out to enjoy the sun, which you don't see today nearly as much. Eagle Bay had an Olympic-sized diving platform, and they again, huge social events during the summer. And now yacht clubs are taking the place of that, and they provide haven for more boats over 10 meters than any other community on Canada's west coast. But it's a different atmosphere. You know, if you own a yacht, you don't generally hang around on the beach. You know, I guess you get on your yacht and you sail to wherever. But between 1925 and 1950, and maybe a bit later in some areas, this was you know, activities of you know, socializing and good times were far more common than they are now. Yes. And this is in Dunderab. Dunderab Regatta was one of the big festivals, and you know, you can see people made their own fun, and I hope there was water underneath, because if not, I wouldn't like to vouch for their safety. But it was there were also very serious swimming competitions and various activities. And again, many people coming there, not only from West Vancouver, North Vancouver, but also from Vancouver as well. It was a place where people came, and a place where there was a real community, and a community which has been going through a lot of changes recently. So, anyway, now this is Joseph Leyland's house. Joseph Leyland was reeved from 1930 to 1940. He was West Vancouver's man of the half century from 1900 to 1950. And he saw Vancouver as a place not at the end of the road, but a kind of a node for communication to other places. He was very active in promoting the building of the Lionsgate Bridge and the building of the bridge across the Capilano to North Vancouver. Very active in promoting Whistler, although, you know, the dream of that as a park that he had didn't come until after his death. And although he was you know, a very important person in the community, he had this modest house, two-bedroom house. He and his wife subsidized their income by renting out to boarders during the Depression. They also had two cottages that they rented out. Just out of curiosity recently, I checked the BC Housing Assessment, and there was a new house built there in 1997. This is at the foot of Rogers Creek. The assessed value in 2017 was $18,952,000, and it's a nice enough house, but it's not that big really. I mean, it's there. So it's gone down. If maybe you can pick up a bargain, it's gone down a couple of million since then. But you know, it's the high price of houses is something which only really came about starting in the 60s and largely just in the last 20 years or so. Okay, and now this is Joseph and his wife Etta. They are off to see the Queen. Queen Elizabeth came when the Lionsgate Bridge was officially opened, and she made the memorable statement, "This seems to be the place to be," when she was up in British Properties. And Joseph Leyland was also a great promoter of British properties, and no doubt the presence of the Queen did not do any harm to their sales, because you know, it certainly took a while to take off, but it became extremely desirable to live there. And yeah, in 1931, the British Properties purchased 4,000 acres in West Vancouver for a princely sum of $75,000. And the land had been acquired by the municipality for unpaid taxes because when the land boom in Vancouver ended around 1913, there was a lot of land that had been bought in West Vancouver reverted to the municipality for lack of payment of taxes. And the municipal leaders at the time were smart enough to not sell it off piecemeal because they thought that, well, you know, maybe we got something going here, and so they did. And so the British properties came along. Their land stretches all the way from Capilano near the end of Lionsgate Bridge all the way across to Horseshoe Bay. And the development of it has proceeded with cautious, I suppose, well-planned caution over the last 80 years. And there's another 20 years at least of development to take place. As Jeff Kroll, the CEO, told me with a kind of a sigh that, you know, we have 20 more years of dealing with the municipality and citizens groups, but they are now dealing with it in a much more consultative way than happened in the early years. And most of the people who lived in the British properties worked in Vancouver. And I think this started a dichotomy in West Vancouver that continues today. My guess is, and it's kind of an educated guess, that most of the people in the rest of West Vancouver worked in West Vancouver, and to a large extent still do. But the people in the British properties, they originally worked mostly in Vancouver. Now they work everywhere, you know, and it's become a I don't know, a kind of a pied-à-terre for a lot of people who work either back in China, in Europe, you know, you name it, or any parts of Canada and the States. And so this has led to kind of I'd have to say a lack of involvement on the part of too many British Pacific Properties people with the community, as you know, they have kind of perhaps larger fish to fry. And so now the Olmsted brothers were the designers of British properties. Frederick Olmsted was the founder of modern American landscape architecture. And this is the entrance along Taylor Way. And their efforts were to make the British properties a replica of a British estate. There are pretty clear parallels between what Caulfield did and what British properties did, although the results are very different. And you know, certainly British properties, although it was it's called British properties, it was really designed as a fulfillment of the American dream. And you know, buying a house which was large and you know, reflected your status in society and so on. And there were many things that Olmsted planned which did not happen. They had plans for a polo field, but that didn't go over. They also had plans for a shopping center at the top of Taylor Way, but that didn't happen either, although Park Royal, a little further down the hill, was planned and opened in 1950. And I may be a bit cynical, but I can see them that, you know, they built these wonderful properties, wonderful houses, British properties, and that attracted the men. But the women, of course, they might have thought, would all want to go shopping, so we'll build Park Royal for them. And maybe that's a bit, I wouldn't be surprised, at least, if that was part of their thinking. And so initial sales of the British properties were slowed by the Depression and war. By 1946, in spite of Queen Elizabeth's recommendation, only 70 houses had been built. And then after the war, Perry Willoughby, who was the first manager of British properties and others, they rethought their plans, and instead of targeting the super rich, as had been the original plans, they targeted the affluent middle class. and lots were made smaller, trees were cut, and the shopping center was planned and built. The person who was largely responsible for this is the lady sitting there, Muriel May. She was the hugely successful salesperson, often referred to as the world's most glamorous salesperson, real estate salesperson anyway. And she was enormously successful in promoting British properties. Without her, it would have, you know, who knows what might have happened, but it might have taken a lot longer to become successful. And the initial houses were not all that expensive. And Kenwood's House of Ideas in 1948 was a 5-room show home marketed for $11,500. And it included all the latest amenities, a garbage disposal, dishwasher, and a built-in bar. And you know, if you consider that average size homes in the British properties now sell for 3 to 5 million, which is about, what's that, about 500 times that amount. You know, there's the increase certainly has not been proportional to salaries in any way. And now, the development of British properties, this coincided with the development of architectural modernism in Canada. And one way I like to look at modernism is it's based on clean, simple lines, flat roofs, generally one story, unlike the fussy Victorian type homes that had been built largely on the North Shore at all, like, I mean, think Shaughnessy, whatever. And I think there's a parallel between the artistic development of architecture and the development, say, of music. You know, I mean, think the Richard Strauss, and then think modern classical music. And in many ways, I think the Modernist houses are like the modern classical music of our time. And these were generally flat-roofed homes. They had a deep connection to the landscape. There was generally a lot of natural features were incorporated, largely influenced by Japanese architecture and Japanese culture. The interiors were generally open with lots of glass and wood, and they emphasized innovations that industrial materials and new technology allowed. This is one of the homes built by Russ Hollingsworth, who was one of the main modernist architects. He built 14 of these in West Vancouver, and a number more in North Vancouver. This is still in use, and it was on the Homes tour a couple of years ago. A very nice home. And they were conceived, as he did, as homes which the average Canadian could afford. The intent of modernism in architecture in West Vancouver, at least, was to you know, provide a place where the post-World War II average, or you know, fairly maybe a bit above average family could find a place. This did not happen. You know, the land prices went out of sight, and so it did not happen, unfortunately, but that was the original intent. And now this, some of you may recognize, is the home belonging to B.C. Binning, which again is still standing in Altamont. It's 1,400 square feet. It is one of the iconic modernist houses in certainly in the Lower Mainland, and no doubt beyond that. It was built in 1941 on Mather's Crescent, but it's not doing so well. The rains have affected its viability. You can see there it's looking a little bit shabby, and apparently it's in need of extensive renovation if it is not to be torn down. And it right now I don't think legally can be torn down because it's designated a heritage structure, although that hasn't stopped some people in West Vancouver in the past, but hopefully that would not happen anyway. And so what do? You know, how do you save this house? So what some people have come up with, like Don Luxton and Robert Jeller, is you build another house on the same lot, And the plan in this is you kind of, it's on a slope, so you can build a house which is kind of going kind of on that side and build it below this level, and it will have actually a green roof, like literally a grass roof. And then you sell this house for you know, a couple $1 million or whatever, and then you use that money to renovate B.C. Binning's house. You know, it's running into a lot of problems, and I'm not privy to all of them. I think, Dave, you probably know more than I do about that. But you know, that is still the intent, to save Binning's house in that way. Okay, this unfortunately the description. This is one of Norris's cartoons, got cut off, but the person who is going to buy this house says, "If I sign this mortgage at these prices, it won't be the land of the free, but it sure will be the home of the brave." And this was in 1967. And this seemed to be about the time when house prices started to concern people. And of course, they haven't stopped concerning people since. And, okay, thank you. And so the cost of homes has spiraled out of control with the escalation of land prices. And of course, land is now 80 to 90% of the cost of a home. And you know, if you think of it, houses are not expensive. You can build a house in Vancouver, you can build a house in Kapuskasing, you can build a house in Shanghai, in Jakarta, and the cost of building a similar house is very close between all of these cities. But what makes the difference is the cost of the land. And so here, the cost of the land is driven by supply, and the desire many have to live in one of the most gorgeous locations in the world. I've referred a lot to a book by Richard Florida in my book, Who's Your City? And Richard Florida is an urban thinker, and he says the reason people move to a place is not primarily for work. They move primarily because of its appearance and the amenities, whether they are parks, recreation, entertainment, whatever they are. And so this has happened to West Vancouver, and I guess really to Vancouver as well. But the thing is, of course, that that means that people move here who can't really afford to, and this is, or maybe they don't move here because they can't afford to, and so this is one of the things that West Vancouver and elsewhere in the Lower Mainland are dealing with. And so, so what do you do? You know, industry is a very bad word in West Vancouver. There was a conscious attempt to eliminate industry in the early years. Never happened totally, but just read one example of an industry which now is now going on in West Vancouver. Probably most people even in West Vancouver don't know. And so Ray Wood lives with his wife Robin Wenner in the basement of the Black Cat Grocery, spending much of his time in his Land Rover, traveling across Africa 3 times and Australia twice. He has transformed many of these recent experiences into a novel, Stalking Geraldine. But even more remarkably, he manufactures overdrives for Land Rovers, making about 100 a year from parts imported from the US and machined by a lathe in his shop in the Black Cat. Designed as an extra gear, these give the vehicles better performance and economy. And even though probably it doesn't fit in with the zoning regulations in his area, I don't think anyone would seriously question his right to do that. And I thought, well, you know, what if you had other industry? You know, how would that affect West Vancouver? And of course, I don't really know. You know, people have suggested, well, maybe film studios, maybe the Silicon Valley of the North. So if you, for example, built a you know, a computer-oriented industry or business anyway in the North Shore, then people would have to live fairly close, and they probably wouldn't want to live out in White Rock and commute. And so would that then encourage the building of more affordable housing that then they would use? Or the same with film industry. Would, if you built film studios, would, although probably people get paid more with there, but would that encourage accommodation for people like that? I don't know. This is the type of thing that West Vancouver has to wrestle with. So anyway, here we have one of the modernist homes more recently. This is the Creek Van Dam house in 1962, and the next one is the Taylor house in 1983. And these, I mean, that is a spectacular house. It's a beautiful house. But would I want to live there? I mean, if you offered it to me, I guess I would say, indeed I would. But it seems to me that it's lacking a lot of the human dimension that homes should have. If you have kids, are they going to go out and play on the balcony? I don't know, not my kids. But the modernism and a lot of architecture in West Vancouver has traded some of the human element for the spectacular, and you know, anyway, that's the way it's gone. But anyway, and the next one, now that is your nice little starter castle there. It was actually taken from a drone, and again, a huge home. I don't know how many square feet that is, but it's a lot. They are building houses. There are many houses, well over 10,000 square feet, and there's this one being built near North Vancouver High School of all places, or West Vancouver High School of all places, which is 26,000 square feet. And you know, it's very hard to limit that. I talked one time with one of the people working at the municipality, and I'd say, well, you know, can't you guys stop this? And he said, well, you know, this is a democracy. We do what the people want. And I'm not sure if that's a very good explanation, but there's a reluctance on the part of some people to come down too hard on people that are maybe in some cases abusing the you know, the rights to build what they want. And I know in a lot of places they have gone even against the community regulations, municipal regulations that were there. And well, it's hard once you build a house. You know, what do? You know, do you tell them to tear it down? But this, as far as I know, was built quite legally, but others maybe not always. Anyway, and this is the Vincent Residence. Valiant Vincent was a well-known photographer in Reeve, and again, somewhat with the Binning House, there's been a move in West Vancouver to try and salvage some of the older homes like this, a very nice craftsman style bungalow from the 1920s, to try and find ways in which heritage houses can be preserved. And with this house, what they did, they totally, well, they renovated while keeping the facade and as many as possible of the historic elements. But the house was made into two separate residences. There was a laneway house and a carriageway house built on the same property, so that for one house, now you have four, and that's good. Again, it's not going to you know, satisfy the workers at Starbucks, because it's certainly the smaller homes in this area cost around $2 million. So again, it's a great way of preserving a heritage home, not unfortunately a way of creating affordable homes. And so now this is one of the new apartments, Bellevue. And one of the problems in West Vancouver, as I think in Vancouver as well, is the lack of rental space, the lack of apartments that are in any way, shape or form affordable. The apartments here cost in the neighborhood of $2 million each, and you know, there are very few rentals in West Vancouver, although some are being built. The apartments started to become built around 1960 with Crescent Apartments, the first high-rise, and the push from then has been to increasingly build more apartments, although these have not been done without a lot of community opposition, and sometimes valid, sometimes not, I think. And theoretically this increases density, but in spite of all the new buildings that are going up in West Vancouver, as I mentioned, the population of West Vancouver has remained far below projections. Even the you know, the doomsayers back in 1980 were saying that, you know, there are going to be 60,000 people living here, and in effect the population has increased very little, and you know, it's in spite of apartments like this and new developments like the Oney and Grosvenor and Ambleside, which seem to be the way that most of the apartment buildings are going now. And the Oney and the Grosvenor, while modernism has not really taken hold in most recent residences, but it has become adapted to larger apartments like the Oney and Grosvenor, and also in buildings like the Glen Eagles Community Centre, which is a fine example of modernism adapted to a larger building, and you know, a fine building. So so anyway, we're kind of should be, yeah, oh yeah. So this, of course, is a beautiful area, and parks have been one of the main assets of West Vancouver, and they have been made largely possible by the generosity of some of the early residents, people like Francis Caulfield and John Lawson, who donated land that has now benefited many and serves as a bit of an antidote to the high-priced housing. And then in the 1940s there was another push by people like Roy Pigeon and Claire Downing and a minute here, getting to the right place, and they enabled a lot of new parks to be built, quite often putting their own money on the table to buy land that then could be used for parks. More recently, Heinz Berger, who has worked for the parks for many years, dedicated his career to their legacy, often going around raising money on weekends, door to door, getting money for the parks. And does the same spirit of altruism still exist? That is the, I guess, the question. I know there are a lot of altruistic people in West Vancouver, a lot of people who dedicate their work to it, but I don't know. I won't comment on that. So now, okay, finally, the final slide here is British properties, and they are engaged in plans which will transform that part of West Vancouver. There are 3 scenarios that they are working on, and this will take place over a period of the next 20 years or so. And all of them include many residences, and some of them include extensive commercial development as well. It could add up to 8,000 residents in the community, and it could, if done right, it could create a wonderful community. It ain't going to be cheap, you know, and that's just one thing you kind of have to reconcile yourself to with West Vancouver, that the pressures are they're not only local, they're international, and for there ever to be cheap housing there, there would have to be major changes in thinking. And you know, I don't know, it could happen, but I think for now what we can hope for at West Vancouver, and perhaps elsewhere, is creating a community where everyone is valued and where people can work and live together in a, you know, a mutually beneficial way. And one interesting thing kind of relating to that is British properties, some of the people in the education system realized that there were problems with people living there because there was not there weren't the amenities that people should have in the British properties. Like, they had these huge homes, but there was very little communication. Many of them, of course, you know, might be living with 1 or 2 children, maybe 1 or 2 parents, quite often not speaking English. British properties has one of the highest at-risk rates for kindergarten children in British Columbia, 33% to be exact. And so the Chartwell Properties, British Properties Family Hub was started in Chartwell School, and they are addressing that, and they are helping to integrate the people who are, you know, coming into West Vancouver in the last few years into a more, I guess, Canadian way of life. And it's working, but it is a struggle. It's difficult because you know, there's a lot of cultural barriers to overcome.
What does at risk mean? What do you use that?
There are 5 categories I use. There's financial, which is generally not a problem. There's linguistic. There's social, emotional, kind of those composite of things. And this is according to a study that was done, and certainly one can understand the difficulty of living in British properties, which I think in the 80s and 90s was built in a way which was unwise. That they built homes which were far too big for what they wanted, and once you build it, it's pretty hard to change. So I see that there are these areas that West Vancouver is confronting, which I think are very important. And there's the problem of affordability. And is it possible to have an affordable places in West Vancouver, and what does really affordable mean? And there's the demography. It is becoming increasingly a city where older people live. The younger people, especially the middle generation, are not living there because they can't afford it. And there are the problems of isolation and alienation, especially with a lot of older people. There are problems that you know, certainly exist with their lives. And there's the role of the municipality. And you know, I talked to Walter McLean, who was the former CEO of British Properties, one time, and he said what he would really like, he would like someone to just go in there and take them by the scruff of the neck. He didn't use those words, but kind of more or less that, and bring the developers and the public together, and bring everyone together, and you know, kind of no more Mr. Nice Guy type of thing. And I've heard a number of people say that in the current West Vancouver too. I don't know if you can do that, but there's certainly a feeling of frustration. As you know, as one person, they had a number of meetings put on by the West Vancouver Community Foundation, and you know, a lot of people were saying that, well, you know, are we just going to become a Hollywood North, you know, where we have you know, affluent people living here, and of course all the workers coming in from outside, as maybe kind of a modern day version of the Shanghai Bund, where you have the Europeans doing their business and the low-paid workers coming in. Just kind of one related thing, in the Lionsgate Hospital, which is admittedly in North Vancouver, but close by, they are desperate to get cleaners to work there. They will pay any person who is working there as a cleaner $400 if they can find another worker. And you know, cleaning is maybe something that is not so important in some areas, but in hospitals it's pretty important. And so there are these things which are, I don't know if they're ticking time bombs, might be a bit stronger word, but I think there are certainly a lot of areas that would be nice to have addressed, and maybe they will be, I hope. So that kind of sums up pretty much my talk, and now if I suppose there are questions or comments, certainly I would be glad.
Thank you, Francis. That was wonderful. Please have a round of applause.
Thank you.
Questions?